There's been a lot of unsavory things coming from Bioware over the last 10 or so years, from poor game launches or, the real life issues like veteran employees being axed mid-development of Dragon Age's next entry. So, since Bioware's had me hooked since 2009 with Dragon Age Origins, and things haven't really been looking too hot from the outside, I've decided to take a plunge into Bioware's history to see how exactly they went from making games like Baldur's Gate 2 and Dragon Age Origins to, well, Anthem.
I've had enough of your disingenuous assertions.
So, for those who don't know what Bioware is a game studio that formed back in 1995, and they were once known as one of the biggest developers in the medium, being behind the games like Baldur's Gate, Knights of the Old Republic, Dragon Age, and Mass Effect. Now, we'll get to those games in a bit, but for now, let's delve into their early years. Bioware was formed by a small group of 6 people, 3 of which, Ray Musica, Greg Zeschuk, and Augustine Yip, had recently graduated from medical school at the time, which is a fact I decided to add in for some reason. The whole group ended up having to pull their resources together to make their first game, which isn't actually Baldur's Gate like I had assumed. It was a mech simulation game called Shattered Steel. There was some internal fighting among the 6 founders, and after some complaints from Brent Oster, Zeschuk's cousin, Marcel, who was one of the other 6 founders, was fired. And quickly after, Brent would have issues with another founder, but the group ended up standing behind him, and Brent and his brother Trent Oster ended up leaving Bioware to form Pyrotech Studios and continue development of Shattered Steel. But Pyrotech Studios ended up falling apart after a year from more issues with Brent and Trent, so the brothers ended up splitting apart, and Trent came back to Bioware, where the rest of the founders would help finish the game. So Shattered Steel ended up finishing about a year later, and it was published by Interplay Studios. And unlike Bioware's future works, the focus on this game was more on the gunplay, with the story mostly happening in the background, similar to like how live service games act today. The game takes place in a desolate future where humanity is on the verge of extinction, and you play as like a random mech pilot tasked with saving it. You travel across like 22 worlds and fight off the enemies, changing mech suits with customizable combat styles. It was cool stuff for the time, but it definitely stands out as a black sheep among Bioware's library, and it's often forgotten about. And it's the only game on this list that I haven't, nor will I ever play, because I don't know, it's just too old. But despite the lack of focus on storytelling, the game still performed modestly, receiving 7s on the review board. It did well enough that they actually had plans to follow up the story with a sequel, but Interplay Studios stepped in and basically said the sales numbers weren't really worth the trouble. So Bioware then shifted into 2 separate teams, one working on MDK2 for some damn reason, we'll get into that, and the other beginning to form a new pen and paper digital RPG called Battleground Infinity. Now I know what you're thinking, what is that? I've never heard of it. Well, that's because it actually never got past the demo stage, since everyone in the company agreed that it just wasn't really that good. But someone within Black Isle Studios, which was a division of Interplay, liked what they saw in the demo and thought that the engine worked really well within the Dungeons & Dragons license that they had recently acquired from Strategic Simulations Incorporated. So, with most of Bioware's team being fans of D&D, they quickly decided to make a game to be in the D&D canon, with the entire cast of characters in the game coming from the team's own campaigns from their personal stuff. The game's story would be led by Lucas Christensen and James Olin. Midway through its development, Trent Oster ended up forming another internal team and leading the development of what would be Neverwinter Nights, with the focus shifting to the idea of giving players more freedom to form their own campaigns within the game instead of a plot that they would follow. He'd end up spending another 5 years in development for that ambition, leading like a 75-man team at like the age of 23, which is fucking crazy. Anyways, Bioware ended up finally releasing Baldur's Gate in December of 1998, after 3 years of development. The game would follow a custom player character after your adopted dad, Gorion, is killed, and you end up venturing through the Sword Coast and recruiting people along the way while uncovering your past and all that. It's a pretty simple concept. I don't need to explain much else. It's a Bioware plot. It still holds up really well. I'm not saying that. It's still a decent game. The game made a huge impact in the market. Despite the expectations set that RPGs were simply dead in the space, Bioware's game ended up selling over 200,000 units, and by the end of 1998, they had amassed over $2 million. Of course, they followed up on the success with the Sword Coast expansion, and the team immediately began work on a sequel. While the development began on Baldur's Gate 2, the other team had just finished up MDK2, which was the sequel to Shiny Entertainment's third-person run-and-gun shooter. This was Bioware's first game to release on consoles, which is something to note. So, in 2001, Baldur's Gate 2 was released by the A-Team. It was able to release sooner, obviously, because the game used the same engine and systems, but the game definitely had improved on the writing from the first entry. And Bioware was able to follow this up with 2 more big story expansions within the next year. I'll be the first to tell you, Baldur's Gate 2 was so much better than the first game. Trust me, it got the praise it deserved, obviously, but yeah, Baldur's Gate 2 was really good. It ended up winning IGN's Game of the Year award, which is, yeah, that's cool, I guess. I'd also like to note that during the expansions, writer Drew Carpetman, I don't know, joined the team. He didn't work on the actual game, but he did, work on the final expansion. So, moving on, in 2002, Neverwinter Nights would release. And yes, it too was very successful. Though, unlike the last 2 games, this is where the Bioware magic ended up coming in, with the lead developer, Trent Oster, saying that the team had to crunch the last 2 years of development, beginning to work 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. He recalled that on the last 2 weeks before the game shipped, he personally had worked over 200 hours. That shit's crazy. Despite the crunch, the team was satisfied with the work they had done and was still holding on firm. And with just 7 years behind them, Bioware now had made 3 massively successful RPGs and several expansions, alongside supplying Black Isle Studios with the engine to make Planescape and the Icewind games. They were obviously a powerhouse, and one that wasn't slowing down anytime soon. Because you see, back in 2000, it had been announced that Bioware had reached out and began to develop a Star Wars game alongside LucasArts. The game was in development for around 3 years, with its lead writer now being Drew Karpyshyn. I don't know if that's how you say his name, so I'm just gonna say weird stuff that sounds like it. Just get used to it, I guess. And this was not only Bioware's first RPG on consoles, but it was the first Star Wars RPG that I could call ever. The audience they'd amassed after only making D&D licensed RPGs for PC would more than double as long as it was actually good. And it obviously was. Thanks to no small part of LucasArts, who were reportedly very liberal with the IP at the time. They allowed Bioware to choose to set the game 4,000 years before the first movie, which would give them more creative freedom to do whatever they want. And the story ended up following another player-created avatar with your own name, as you're left with amnesia and go through, some Jedi trials in order to track down this big bad guy called Malik. There's obviously more to it, but I want to stay pretty vague here, because I think if you're lucky enough to not have this spoiled so far, you should experience this story. Or, at least wait, 15 more years for the remake to come out and somehow make it worse. Anyways, moving on. The game released in 2003 and had sold over 250,000 units in just the first 4 days, which is crazy, especially when you realize this was only on the original Xbox, since the PC port wouldn't even come out for another 4 months. So yeah, after making such a good game, Bioware ended up getting the opportunity to make a sequel, but the publishers at Microsoft had wanted it to be released within the next year. So Bioware passed on it, believing that they couldn't do the quality they wanted to at the time, and it eventually was given to Obsidian, which you can see how that turned out. Can you imagine if this kind of stuff happened today? What if Insomniac was like, we don't want to make the 3rd game now, so Ubisoft got the Spider-Man IP? That's, God, don't happen, please. But anyways, I also want to say that when they made KOTOR, it had its own development hell, because they had to make it in its entirely new engine, known as the Odyssey engine, since the game was transitioning from the over-the-top perspective that the Baldur's Gate games had started to an over-the-shoulder type. This engine is what they developed the next couple of games on, including Jade Empire, which would be Bioware's first original IP on the Xbox, since Microsoft still had a deal with Bioware, hoping to repeat the success of KOTOR, which it did not do. This game would follow yet another player-created avatar that is a spirit monk. You end up learning a whole lot of martial arts and meeting some dope people as you adventure to stop, the big bad guy of the Jade Empire. It's a plot. I'm not going to keep explaining the plots of these games. Just play them if you want, or, you probably already have. Don't get me wrong, the people that played it liked it. It just didn't get the recognition it deserved. And the game underperformed hardcore when it released in 2005, at least when it came down to sales expectations for the company, which now wasn't looking too good since their next big games were still a few years out from release. Now this is where things start to shift for the company. So, Electronic Arts ex-president John Riccitiello, or is that his name? I don't care about this guy. had recently went off and started a new independent studio called Elevation Partners. Now, Elevation Partners had reached out in 2005 and offered to invest $300 million and create a partnership between Bioware and Pandemic Studios, who were the company behind the Clone Wars game, as well as Destroy All Humans 1 and both Battlefront games at the time. Two very hot studios on the console front. And the partnership would help Bioware by giving them more minds to bounce ideas off of, better tech to work with, all while continuing to develop the games that they wanted to. It was, a no-brainer. Except Elevation Studio apparently hadn't budgeted in the change in the field, going from the original Xbox to the 360, which would nearly double the budgets both developers would need. I also just want to note that around this time, Mass Effect 1 and Dragon Age Origins were in development in Bioware, so those are those two games. Anyways, around 2 years later, during the development of Mass Effect, John Riccitiello ended up leaving Elevation and joining back with EA, which left Elevation Studios in a bad spot, and it was clear that both Pandemic and Bioware were going to be left in the dust with no more budget. And this is where it gets kind of sketchy. Now Bioware and Pandemic Studios are in a really bad spot and they don't have any choice or they'll shut down, and EA reaches out to Bioware and the studio and offers to buy them out for $625 million. Obviously Bioware was excited because they thought this would give them the huge budget to work with and keep them afloat, but apparently, work just continued like usual. Except now they had to move their workspace going from walking distance to a drive. Around this time, both companies ended up having to undergo a huge work culture and environmental change. And at the same time, Dragon Age was having its own development hell, having to completely change from the older Aurora engine that had been used for the Neverwinter Nights to a new Eclipse engine. And around this time, Trent Oster would switch back over to a game lead to follow his own little vision of an episodic James Bond-like game with a big emphasis on character building and stealth. I assume it was something similar to Alpha Protocol, which would have been really cool. But EA shut it down, saying that they might make it into a Facebook game, which caused him to officially leave Bioware and help form Beamdog and doing his own thing. Now, even though EA had started to clamp down on Bioware, they still had a majority of their talent, and both of their biggest games had already been in development. Mass Effect 1, which was another original IP, was directed by Casey Hudson, and its lead writer was Drew Carpetman. The game would be a third-person shooter that took place in space, and was definitely Bioware's biggest project to date. They had to create an entirely new world, supported by numerous books after it launched in 2007 to critical acclaim. It was also different than the older Bioware games because it was their first game with a voice protagonist and a focus on cinematography, being developed in the new Unreal Engine 3. The player would take on the role of Commander Shepard, voiced by either Mark Mee or Jennifer Hale, as they track down a rogue agent before he can doom the galaxy, yada yada yada. So yeah, it was a third-person shooter. It involved squad-like tactics where you could command your squad to do certain things, and your choices and dialogue would affect the outcome. Like an actual RPG, but now it was like controlling a movie instead of a game. It was really cool. I'm going to try to leap forward now because I don't really need to tell you the reception of these next couple of games. You already know we all love the first Mass Effect game. And Dragon Age Origins was also received very well. And, it's one of the best games ever made, but I'm not biased there. Even though it also had some deeply rooted struggles in its development, which can help explain the most why it looks older than Mass Effect, even though it came out 2 years later, and also why it still has the silent protagonist approach that they used to do. I do also want to point out that the teams here are different for both games. So while Drew Carpet Cleaner led the writing for Mass Effect 1, David Gator actually led Dragon Age Origins. Alright, so let's cut to the games that only began development under EA's supervision. Starting with, the best space game ever created, Mass Effect 2. So Mass Effect 2 was developed with a focus on having all the side stories getting just as much care as the main story, which is why it's so divisive for fans of the trilogy, with the main plot not really driving the story forward as much as the other two games, since its story resides in the characters and world building with the crew and their loyalty missions. You see, the game follows up roughly 2 years later after the first game, with your imported Shepard gathering a different crew and essentially preparing for a suicide mission for the whole game. A lot of people felt like the plot had no relevance and hindered the pacing of the third game. I also saw a lot of people try to say that the shift from core gameplay mechanics, like instead of having overheating guns, you would now have to manually reload with thermal clips, was EA's interference trying to make it more like modern shooters. But EA really didn't mess with Bioware too much on this game. Most of the changes they made were either from fan reception or just, internal decisions they had made while making the first game, since they kind of were developing it along the same time. Most of this game's development issues that actually come from the flu pandemic and the recession back in 2009. And despite all this criticism, the game sold very well and is still heralded by many as Bioware's peak. But sadly, this was the last game that EA wouldn't be heavily involved in, which is why I'd like to say that exactly after the launch of Mass Effect 2 was where the tides began to shift for Bioware. Now, we're going to talk about one of BioWare's strangest games. No, it's not Sonic. No thank you. That's not even a thing. We're gonna talk about Dragon Age 2, or what should have been called Dragon Age Exodus. You see, Dragon Age 2 had a very rough development cycle. EA had essentially stepped in and wanted to keep the momentum going from how successful Dragon Age Origins had been, so they needed BioWare to release the game within 14 months. And during the development, the game's goals were constantly being moved just out of reach, and the team had to completely up and cut many promising aspects to meet the said goals. The game had been so rushed by EA's guidelines that even like the musical score had bugs in it that needed polishing after release. I've never heard of that before. Not to mention all the bigger issues fans have, like the repeated locations and the boring combat loop. That's one thing about BioWare is every single one of their games needs like a 20-minute video on just its own development cycle. They all go through so much hell. But that being said, a lot of fans have stated that BioWare changed the combat because EA wanted them to make it a more generic third-person RPG to meet sales expectations. But all I've seen on the matter suggests that Mike Laidlaw had actually decided early on that they would change the combat to be faster and easier since Dragon Age Origins had apparently been too difficult for casual players based on the fan feedback they were receiving. So I'm not sure about all that. Maybe I'm wrong there. I'm down to be corrected if someone can give me the right source, but as of now, it seems like it was his decision. Anyways, Dragon Age 2 was the first game to really show the shift in BioWare's quality.
This game still feels like Origins, despite feeling completely different.
They still had their best writers on board, but you could really feel the rush job in the gameplay. And it was even worse for those that were coming from Dragon Age Origins to see, you know, the new Mass Effect approach to the writing and the cinematography, no silent protagonist. There's a lot of issues. Again, a separate video.
You exist because we allow it, and you will end because we demand it.
They're harvesting us. They're here to wipe us out.
What do you want from us? Slaves? Resources?
My kind transcends your very understanding.
So yeah, Dragon Age 2 was received pretty poorly by most, especially fans of the last game, and it's still quoted by many to be the worst BioWare game out of the bunch. I still like Dragon Age 2, especially Hawk. She's a great protagonist, but, you know, everybody's got their opinions about the trilogy. After the launch of Dragon Age 2, a bunch of quality writers had decided to jump ship from BioWare, including one of Mass Effect's lead writers, Drew Carpetman, leaving Mac Walters as the new lead writer. Now, I'm not blaming him for Mass Effect 3's shortcomings. I'm just pointing out that Drew had been a lead writer for the two previous games, so losing someone that high up in the narrative department, as well as many more, at the end of a trilogy is gonna sting. And it did. The development of Mass Effect 3 ended up pretty similar to Dragon Age 2. With the exception that they were able to get an extension of a few months on the release date. Now, I really can't say how EA affected this game beyond release dates and sales expectations. I've scoured the internet, and I can't find much about their involvement. I really can't. So maybe the blame is more on BioWare's upper management and not EA itself, but either way, the change in direction for Mass Effect 1 and 2 compared to this one was very apparent even at the time. The writing had less polish, the combat seemed to get more of a focus, they added a mandatory multiplayer mode and introduced the fabled loot boxes into EA's master plan. The choices were slimmed down to about 2 options for each dialogue with Shepard. The Mass Effect 2 companions were cut back on since they didn't have time to account for their fate in the last game, including the romances. They added a new companion into the fold for new players instead of focusing on the ones from the past. The narrative had plenty of cuts, including key side characters in the entire Dark Space plot. That's, again, another video. And we can't forget about that nasty introduction of Day 1 DLC, which included the whole companion who was arguably the most important companion in the trilogy. It's very pathetic. I honestly cannot imagine these decisions were made by someone like Casey Hudson, especially since he ended up leaving the company right after the game launched. Look, still, no spoilers. I love this trilogy even though I disagree with the direction it ended up going in, so I'll save it for a future video. So, around the same time of Mass Effect 3, BioWare Austin were put in charge of the WoW killer, supposed WoW killer, Star Wars The Old Republic, which BioWare stated was supposed to be KOTOR 3 through 9. We all know how that ended up going. It started with a sub fee, and then it went to free-to-play, and now BioWare has been completely removed from the project. I do want to say, though, that The Old Republic is actually a really good story game. Ignoring what happened to the characters from the previous KOTOR games, the MMO has like 8 complete storylines, letting you either be like a Jedi, a Sith, a bounty hunter, Imperial agent, etc. Each one should take you like 50 hours without the expansions. It offers a lot, and I personally think these storylines are really well written. Especially for like Star Wars writing. If you can at least play through one of them, I'd recommend, the Imperial Agent for a 007 story, the Jedi Knight for more of a classic Jedi story, or, the Sith Warrior because it's badass. It's a really dope game, really. But, the gameplay just is not there. And it was also around this time that the last two founders of BioWare, Ray Musica and Greg Zeschuk, ended up leaving BioWare, which, surely hindered the development of Dragon Age Inquisition, which was well underway, and the, third game of the series, and a complete change of pace. They had switched from the smaller hub worlds to a full-blown open world game, because, of course, this was around the open world craze, which, yikes. Isn't it crazy that Gears of War went open world? Unrelated. Anyways. They'd go back to a custom main character, but also had a voice, leaving them as the middle child in the trilogy of protagonists. The devs also decided to switch into EA's in-home engine, Frostbite, instead of Unreal, which held a host of issues, since it was mainly meant for first-person shooters, like, Battlefield, leaving BioWare to learn the engine and form a new RPG system inside of it. The development cycle was very much like hell, and it lasted about 3 years. They also had to develop the game on both new-gen and last-gen consoles, as well as PC, compared to both 2 and Origins only being on the current gen, and PC, obviously. Honestly, I can say Inquisition was horrible on the 360. I felt then the same way about cross-gen games that I do now. They are just such a waste of time. They had to cut castle sieges and limit a lot of NPC interactions, which is kind of smaller scale compared to the other issues the game had, like they added on like a weird multiplayer mode, and the writers weren't allowed to have enough time to account for the player character being any of the custom races, since they originally had made the game's story with a human mage in mind, closer to Hawk from the last game. The dev cycle was apparently so horrible that the actual devs had hoped that Inquisition would fail, so that the management would realize they need to change how they went about things, which, besides the multiplayer add-on, that did not work out in their favor, because this game won Game of the Year in 2014. And I gotta say, despite me enjoying Origins more, Inquisition is definitely a really good game. It has glaring flaws, it feels like playing a single-player MMO, and BioWare openly has admitted to regretting, filling the open world with generic quests without consideration on how it could affect the main story, which is, it's stuff like that really should not have gone unnoticed by, a studio famous for story games, but I guess that shouldn't be so surprising, since the head writer of the series has came out and said that the studio slowly shifted internally to prioritizing everything but the writing. So, with Inquisition gaining Game of the Year, BioWare's B team, for some reason, was now set on the already established IP for Mass Effect Andromeda, while BioWare's main studio had decided to set their sights on the next big game that made sense for an RPG studio, Anthem, a looter shooter. I'll go ahead and shut down this claim now that EA made BioWare make this game. The truth is, BioWare's senior leads had wanted to make this game for a long time. They had wanted to make something unique, something that stood out over their other IPs. The original idea was like an Iron Man-like game that you can play with your friends. But a couple of years in development, Casey Hudson ended up leaving BioWare, so they tried to just continue down his vision, but then BioWare would set Dragon Age's lead writer, my homie David Gator, over to the lead of writing on the game, which ended up adding a lot of conflict with the two sides of development, since he was making it more like a BioWare plot instead of the game, standing out from their other stuff. That's what he was told to do by the higher-ups, but I guess the other developers weren't in on this. So a year later, in 2016, Gator had enough and left BioWare, so the writing was reverted back to the original vision. The leadership was all over the place, until around 2017, when Casey Hudson would come back to BioWare after working with Microsoft for the last year. And at the same time, BioWare's B team would release Andromeda, one of the worst video game launches of all time. I feel like this is kind of getting repetitive because, it is. Bad management with, dealing with the Frostbite engine just makes for a poor game, I guess. I don't know how they did it with Inquisition, but they also had changed the game to be more hyper-focused and got rid of all the strategy and squad management from the past. So yeah, most people hated the game. It got a few updates to fix some bugs, but its story was abandoned before it could finish with the fabled Quarian arc DLC, which kind of sucks because the story did have potential, but most people didn't even complain. The writing was boring throughout the whole game. We're not going to get into Andromeda though, there are other videos out there for that. The game was so boring, I can't even talk about it. So, back with Anthem's team, they're struggling to course correct after 3 years in development hell, of course with the added trauma of that damn Frostbite engine that keeps plaguing BioWare. I don't know why they haven't shifted yet. They also would have the E3 fiasco of 2018, with a completely fake CGI gameplay trailer that showed the developers the game that the leadership had actually wanted them to make.
Have you been in there yet?
I haven't. We should do that later with Kim.
Yeah, he could use the XP. Hello, treasure.
So they would once again have to course correct the development, with the last year and a half being where the game was actually made. It didn't help that while the game was now aiming to be a new looter shooter, higher-ups would not allow the staff to actually bring up Destiny for any pointers, which that's telling enough for how the management is, that they won't look at the most successful looter shooter of all time to make one.
Am I right? Am I right or am I right?
Anthem came out and immediately faltered like Andromeda. The writing was weak, the gameplay was repetitive, and the AI was poor. It was honestly one of the most boring games I've ever played. Maybe it's better with co-op, but I had to play it solo and I was bored after the first hour. Anthem was dead on arrival, and EA would then step in and shut down the live service once it started to show some actual potential in the 2.0 update, which, seems about on brand for EA. So, now with two very major flops, Bioware's team then shifted to two projects, both from their older IPs. Dragon Age 4, titled Dreadwolf, which is, the larger one with nearly all hands on deck, and Mass Effect 4. And things aren't really looking too hot right now on the set of Dreadwolf. The game's already going through the same song and dance. You see, it was originally being developed as a fully live service game for some reason. Then, after the success of Fallen Order and Anthem's flop, EA would step in and basically told them to completely scrap the live service aspects and apparently allowed the development to be completely reset into a single-player story-focused RPG. So yeah, having to completely shelve one game for another had some consequences on the team, some of which we've already seen from the outside, with a large majority of the team recently being let go, including the last of the old blood in Bioware's writing team. They've essentially removed anybody that had something to do with the series in the past. Not only did they remove them, but they did it very poorly with a severely undercut severance pay. And now the ex-employees are suing Bioware. And, hopefully they win. They definitely deserve at least one win after the last 10 years. So what really happened to Bioware over the years? Well, let's start with the facts. 1. Bioware has always had development issues with every single game they've made, starting all the way back with Shattered Steel. 2. Bioware went broke after Jade Empire, and without EA, they would have been shut down. 3. When EA purchased Bioware, they had to then move shop and essentially change Bioware from a passionate environment to a corpo one. The change of environment caused many of their employees to leave and brought in new ones that fit the corporate lifestyle better. 4. While EA caused a tonal shift at work, the times had also changed in the gaming landscape that we have to account for. And 5. All 6 of Bioware's original founders have been gone since 2012. And number 6, all of Bioware's games since Baldur's Gate 1 have had multiple story expansions set afterwards that are pretty mandatory to get the actual game's ending. So, did EA really kill Bioware? Yes and no.
My brain's been scrambled like an egg.
Yes, they caused the change-ups and shifts in priorities, but they also kept Bioware from shutting down in 2006. And I think we often put too much blame on them instead of the clear lack of direction Bioware's had since its formation in the 90s. Do I think Bioware can come back? No. This current Bioware is essentially a new studio with the old name. Now, that's not saying that they can't make both Dragon Age and Mass Effect good games, but it isn't really a Bioware comeback story even if they do, because Bioware is basically gone. If you want to see what Bioware is doing, the older staff have all moved on into other studios. So you can check them out at Summerfall Studios, where David Gator is at, Archetype Entertainment, where Carpetman went, Humanoid Studios, where I believe Casey Hudson is at. So yeah, that's where Bioware's at now. Alright, that's the journey of Bioware so far, from their first game and hopefully not, but probably their last game. Things aren't looking too hot. I don't usually think oh, it's all gonna be bad. I don't think it's smart to have any hopes for what Bioware makes in the future. The writing hasn't been good since everybody left after Inquisition, so I don't know. I just don't buy it. But anyways, I'll leave links in the description for my sources and also to a few other YouTube videos, not from me, but from other creators that I think you could be interested in, for either cut content from older Bioware games, a review of Anthem on launch to remind you of that, some videos going deeper into the development issues of Andromeda and Anthem, or just another video talking about Bioware from a more experienced creator. If you like this video, there's a like button. I think that helps me. I don't know how this works. And like last time, here's a list of videos I'm planning on making in case you're interested in more and want to subscribe to see how I make them. All right, see you later.